Dear students, in this video we will see how to create an user-defined exception in Java. Okay, so first we have to know what is meant by exception. So exception is an unexpected situation happened during a runtime. Unexpected situation happened during runtime. So this unexpected situation may lead to terminate your program. So you want to handle this exception in a proper manner. So in order to do that, Java supports exception handling that will be done using the use of three keywords. So try, catch, finally, throw and throws. So the keyword try is a block which contains a code, so that may leads to exception. So you want to monitor the code, so that code should be put inside the try block. So once the exception is happen, that will be caught by the catch block, that the proper exception handling will be done. And finally block, so if an exception happens or not, the finally block got executed. The next keyword is throw. So the throw keyword is used to throw the exception manually. And throws keyword is generally related with the function or a method where the exception is thrown from the method, and that will be handled in the function which is calling that particular method. And generally the exception, if we are not using exception handling, then your Java runtime environment only monitor your code. If an exception happens, it creates an exception object and it will throw the exception. So since there is no exception handling mechanism, so that is a default exception handler will be there. So that will handle the exception. But in case of exception handling, we are using the try block to monitor the exception and catch block to handle the exception. So now in our question, we have to create a variable which will hold the age of a person, and that will be initialized during the runtime. And if the user enters age less than 18, your code should generate a user-defined exception called as ineligible voting system. Ineligible voting system, and the description or the message of ineligible voting system to be displayed in the screen is not eligible for voting. So in order to do with the user-defined exception, first we have to create an exception class, that is ineligible voting exception. Because it is a user-defined exception, so the system doesn't know already. So we need to create this exception by creating a class. So go to new class, create the exception ineligible voting system. There is no public static void main, finish. So this is our user defined exception. So once this exception class is created, the system doesn't aware about this class is used for what. What is the property of this class? But now we are going to use this exception class to handle the exception. So every exception class are inherited from the default base class called as exception class. Inside the exception class already we have system exception, that is our runtime exception such as arithmetic exception, index out of bound exception, then class not found exception, then input mismatch exception, number format exception. So these are all system generated exception or runtime exception. They are inheriting from the exception class. But now we are generating a user defined exception. So we need to ensure that this exception also inherited from the exception class. That is the exception base class. So we have to put extends exception, because exception is the base class for all the exception informations. Either it may be a system generated exception or the user defined exception. So once the exception is created, next we have to define a constructor. So constructor public, okay. So once the constructor is defined, so already in the message it is given that when this exception is thrown, we need to display this message in our exception object. So in our constructor, we need to initialize a string that should handle that exception message. So string message. And this information to be passed to our base class. Already we know that. So if I want to invoke my base class constructor, I have to use the super keyword. So now our exception class is ready. So first, if I want to create a user-defined exception, create a user-defined exception class which should be inherited from the exception class. Then we define a constructor, and that constructor will initialize the base class constructor by using the super keyword. So now we'll go to our main program. The main program, first step, we have to create our variable. So I am going to create a variable int age. So I need to get the input from the user during the runtime. So I need to define a scanner class. Scanner s is equal to new scanner system dot in. So if I want to use it, I have to import it. So import scanner. Then by using this, I want to get the value. So age is equal to s dot next int. Okay. So this code, I am getting an input from the user, and based on the user input, I am going to decide whether the age I have entered is less than 18 or greater than or equal to 18. So if it is less than 18, I have to create an user-defined exception, throw it and handle it. So this is the code where I want to monitor to check whether the user entered the input less than 18 or greater than or equal to 18. So I have to put a try block, because try block is mainly used to monitor the code. And once it is there, I need to check if the age value is greater than or equal to 18, no problem. So you have to put S out. So it is eligible for voting. So else the age is not greater than or equal to 18. So that is an exception happened. So you have to create an exception first, then you have to throw the exception. What is the exception if the age is less than 18? The exception name is ineligible voting exception. So we have to create an object for that. Okay. Then when this exception is created, we have to pass a message to our constructor that should be displayed in our error message. The message is not eligible for voting. So that message we are going to pass it in our constructor. So now the exception object is created. Exception object is created. So after creating the object, we have to throw the object. Throw the object. So to throw the object, we have to use the keyword throw. So throw, the object we created is E. So instead of creating the exception in a separate line, throwing the exception in the separate line, we can able to write it in a single line, that is throw new. We just pass this information. So it represents, first it will create the exception object, next it will throw. Okay, so this is the alternative representation. Either you can write it in 2 lines or you can write it in a single line. So now our try block is ready. So every try block, there should be a catch block. So we have created a catch block. So the catch block has to catch what? The exception, whatever you created manually, which is thrown. So that will be caught by the corresponding catch block. So now my catch block is going to catch the exception of type ineligible voting exception. So now I have to display the exception error message. So I am writing exception caught, and along with that I want to display the exception message which is created in our exception object and thrown using this exception object. Now it is caught in this exception object. So E1 contains the exception message. So that we are printing here, E1. So now our program is ready with try, equivalent catch, then throwing the exception. Then finally, I will add the finally. So you already know that even though exception happen or not, the finally will always executed. Okay. So now we are going to check with our inputs. So we are going to run our program. So enter the age which is greater than 18, 20. So you are getting the message you are eligible for voting. Finally is always executed. So now in my code no exception happened. So finally also executed. So next time I run my program, I am giving the exception but the age is 12. So now you see here an exception caught because in the line number 18, if the age is less than 18, automatically it comes to the else part, creating an exception object called as ineligible voting exception. Then by using the throw keyword, it is throwing the exception. When it's thrown, automatically the control come to the line number 32 and the corresponding catch block will handle the exception. After handling it, the finally block got executed even though the exception happened or not. So this exception caught message is displayed, followed by what is our type of exception, that is ineligible voting exception. The error message what you want to display, that is not eligible for voting. So now I think you got an idea how to create an user defined exception and how to use that exception with the keywords try, catch, finally and throw. Thank you.